Hello and welcome back to the Scottish Games Network podcast. This week's a wee bit different, we're going a wee bit shorter and we're covering just everything that happened this week in the Playaway Festival. As always, we're your hosts, I'm Ryan.
I'm Brian.
And I'm Andrew.
And so guys, to start off, as per usual, what have you guys been playing, watching, reading, doing this week?
Nothing. I have lived on Zoom. And here I am again. It's like Groundhog Day. Even my jokes about Groundhog Day are becoming Groundhog Day. It's gone meta and not in a good way.
What about yourself, Andrew? You been up to much?
No, much the same. Just jumping between Zoom calls. But I don't know. It's been enjoyable in its own way. I've learned a lot, so I can't really complain about that aspect of it.
Well,
I do have to admit that I have been listening to an unholy amount of Mogwai's new album as the love continues, and it is wonderful. And fingers crossed, number one. You know, could be their first. So
I'll
good luck,
need
guys.
to get round to that. No, I haven't listened to it yet. Brian's nodding like, yes, do it. Well, I recently decided to get back into comic books. After speaking to Ali, which we'll get into later, I suppose. Yeah, on the channel, I kind of went, I really love reading, but yeah, the thing that holds me back is, like, being dyslexic. Sometimes pacing can be totally ruined. Like, if someone, bursts into a room with urgency and then, the book describes the room, it feels to me, because my reading pace is so slow and I stutter over words, it seems like, they kick the door open and just stand in the doorway for 5 minutes. And then they continue doing what they're doing. So comic books are really good for that, because it just cuts it down straight to dialogue, which is really handy. And I've been reading comic books, in between Zoom calls and stuff. I'll be taking out, a trade paperback and just reading, one issue, and then being like, okay, the break's over, put it down, right, notepad out, and keep going. And I'm currently reading Iron Man Extremis, which was what Iron Man 3 was partially based on. So, all the sort of people that had fiery powers and stuff?
Mm-hmm.
That they took that part of they took that from Extremis and tried to also put in the Mandarin for some reason. But the book itself is really good, so I recommend picking it up. You can get it quite cheap now because it's been out for a good wee while.
I've not looked at an Iron Man book for such a long time. That's a good call. As somebody who grew up with Asterix and Tintin, I think I absolutely should be getting back into more comic books. I think it'll help, cement my street cred with, young people and the kids.
Yeah, especially Tintin.
Well, it's funny you should mention Tintin. That was actually my nickname in school because I was ginger and had a quiff. So
I can see it.
I did it to myself.
I can totally see it.
That's absolutely that's absolutely what we, okay. It's consider yourself with a new nickname, Ryan.
Well,
Again, you've done it to yourself.
Again, I shouldn't have brought it up, but I kind of leaned into it, and then by the time I left school, when we all got Leavers hoodies, we were asked what name do you want on the back of it, and I got Tintin.
I have literally nothing to add to that. Obviously, apart from the fact that I hope you also wore +4s.
Plus 4?
I don't know.
Tintin wore +4s. Do you guys not even know what +4?
I don't know what +4 is.
I don't know what
+4 is.
I'm sorry, Brian.
It's the trousers that end at sort of mid-calf.
Oh,
with your socks pulled up. What the?
I'd have called them 3/4.
Never read Tintin?
I heard that there was some rumor about there being another Tintin film. There was that animated one,
I really liked
10 years ago or something.
That was a solid film. I'd like to see a sequel of that.
I remember people at the time saying the game based on it was actually all right as well. Published by Ubisoft. I don't know who developed it, but
a movie tie-in game that was actually competent that isn't Spider-Man 2.
I think they were doing an Uncharted type cover-based shooter thing.
Oh, the Tintin gritty reboot.
Yeah. Well, they made Harry Potter a cover-based shooter, so they can make anything a cover-based shooter.
That's true, they did, didn't they? That was pretty bad though, wasn't it? That was received poorly.
I don't know.
As part of some of the lectures that I've given at Napier, I used to use the EA games as great examples of how to do licenses badly, and I would use James Bond from Russia with Love and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, and sort of show identical gameplay in each and every single one. The only thing that changed was the weaponry. Harry had a wand, Legolas had a bow and arrow, and James Bond had a shotgun in that way that he did. Never.
Yeah. His
and
iconic
otherwise-
weapon, the shotgun.
Yeah, remember when he kicked open the door and wasted a room full of Russian soldiers?
So anyway, yeah, this was meant to be the Playaway special, and it's become movie tie-in games. Oh well,
We have some ideas for that for the site, so watch this space.
definitely. Main body of our topic today is the Playaway Festival. So let's start off. What have you guys been watching? I think Andrew, you've probably seen the most.
I don't know if that's true. I've definitely seen a few. So what have I seen? The thing that I spent all day yesterday watching was all of the game studies and games research stuff. But I also watched something on the first day as well, which I'm going to remember.
So Jane gave a keynote,
caught the end of that.
and then there was the game design panel with Shay Thompson, John McKellen from No Code, and Dan and Mal. That was wonderful. And then there was a fabulous panel on Tuesday about gaming for health, education, and well-being, which we'll come back to.
I was just gonna say, how was Jane's talk? Because I wasn't able to make it to it. So, do you guys want to tell us a little bit about that?
Inspiring, inspirational, wonderful, eclectic, and wise. Jane is one of the best game thinkers that we have, because she kind of really looks at ways of taking the notion of playful thinking and imaginative solutions to problems that nobody's ever considered, and bringing them to life without ever using the dreaded word gamification. So some of the projects that she's worked on, from Super Better all the way through to the work that she did with the New York Public Library, which was essentially co-writing a book with 500 people, and she got them into the vaults underneath the library, the archives, and they hand-bound their co-written book in the medieval style, and it's now part of the rare books collection. So there are 500 people who can go into New York Public Library, into the vaults, and say, "That's my book," and it's just lovely.
So cool.
It's such exactly. It's not. How can we throw more polygons around the screen, or how can we jam more people into this gore-filled death fest? It's a really different way of thinking about playing, and absolutely loved it. I was trying hard not to type "squee" in the chat pretty much every time she made a good point. So, as an opening to such a fabulous festival, I thought it was bang on.
Kicking off with a bang.
Very much so.
And then later on in the day there was another talk.
Yeah, we had a game
the
design panel.
one.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to pick this one up, Andrew?
Yeah, it was absolutely terrific, despite the fact that I couldn't remember it. So it was with John from No Code, and then there was Dan Pinchbeck, the guy from the Chinese Room, who made everyone's going to the Rapture, and Dear Esther, things like that, and then Malith Abbas from Biome Collective. And they all kind of have different interesting backgrounds as far as game design is concerned, because John is the most kind of typical in that he came from the kind of industry background, but they're all coming at game design from different perspectives. So Mal's kind of in the art world and the kind of avant-garde experimental exhibition art kind of space. Dan came through theatre, and then John is very much approaching it from a kind of film and television influenced perspective. So they had some just lots and lots of really interesting things to say about, I guess, taking influence and design from other places and pushing at the edges of the medium by being able to push games forward by specifically focusing on these spaces in between, where it's not quite a game and it's not quite something else. It's kind of in that middle space. And it was just fascinating stuff, really. Did you catch any of it, Brian?
Yeah. I was there throughout, and the chair, Shay Thompson, also has some really interesting perspectives on games and game design. And you're absolutely right. It's the areas of intersection and convergence, where we're really starting to see some fantastically clever and creative approaches to gaming. Mal and the Biome Collective did Killbox, which was their installation experiential piece, where you play a US drone pilot who's taking out a village, and then you play a child in that village. It's confrontational. It's forcing you to think about things in a very different way, and especially in the last couple of weeks, where we've had the announcement that we've now got the 6 Days in Fallujah game coming back, resurrected, based on real world events, but with quite a, how do we put this, a gung-ho Call of Duty approach to, hey, war, never been so much fun, but without the charming, whimsical, fictional aspects of cannon fodder. That's another cultural reference for you guys to look up after. I thought it was wonderful. And again, it really kind of emphasised where games is innovating, where we're seeing some of the most pioneering work, and it's not necessarily in the mainstream. And for me, this has been one of the most fascinating aspects of the whole festival, and it's exploring those intersections and exploring those areas of convergence. So I thought it was a great first day.
And then, of course, on day 2, we had our very own Brian Baglow chairing a panel. Now, we could, open the floor and all discuss it, but I feel like to start with, Brian, you should definitely tell us what it was about and what went down.
Well, okay, I'll do a quick intro, but then I know that you were both there, so we are going to be asking questions just to make sure you were paying attention.
Of course.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, I was on a panel with Claire from Civic Digits, Elena from Yaldi Games, Carla from Game Doctor, and Max from Glitchers. And I mean, first things first, what an incredible panel. People who are, like the game design panel we were just mentioning, coming from very, very different directions and looking at gaming in terms of its impact on well-being, mental health, and education. So Claire is working with Civic Digits. They're a theatre company who are really working at the intersection of the real and the virtual. And she had some fantastic projects to talk about. Elena, her game Yaldi is working on its first title, Wholesome, Out and About, which combines digital gameplay with getting out into the real world and foraging and crafting and cooking. Wonderful stuff. Carla, we love at the Scottish Games Network because her company Game Doctor is all about public health interventions, but with a gaming focus. And they're currently working on Remedy Quest, their first game looking at the quest for vaccination for COVID. And then finally we had Max from Glitchers, and Max's company produced a game called Sea Hero Quest, which uses spatial navigation to help provide indicators of the potential for dementia, which is mind-blowing. And in the interests of disclosure, I actually worked with the company who was pulling this together and looking at this as a potential area way back in, I think it was 2015, 16. And so I threw a whole lot of companies their way, Glitchers not being one of them, because they weren't in Scotland at that time. So, not part of my fiefdom. But it's a fantastic project and has produced untold, riches in terms of the amount of clinical data it's providing to researchers. And they're now following that up with a financial education game, Nestlings and Nestlums, which we're looking forward to finding out more about. And then their cool driving game, Drive By. So it was phenomenal. And it was just a really freewheeling discussion looking at their projects, their backgrounds, how they got into this, and why they're coming at gaming from a different angle rather than just mere entertainment. So, okay, I was chairing it, but I was trying discreetly to take notes and make little bullet points so I can follow things up with all of these guys, especially Claire, because I think the convergence between the digital world and performing arts is one that we're going to have to push and explore as we try to build our way back into the COVID world. So I'm really looking forward to finding out more about their next project and see if we can do anything to help them.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me when games and medicine sort of come together. I think it's such a fascinating topic. Like, you know, what you're saying about having a game that can sort of spot the early signs of dementia. And not developed in Scotland, so slightly off topic, but I remember a few years ago hearing about a game, I think it was called something like Sail or Flow. I think it was called Flow. And the idea was it was for people with anxiety. And the idea is like in anxiety issues where like you could, if you felt like a panic attack coming on, it was designed that you could open it up and like the music and like the idea that you had to focus on this sort of very basic task would help prevent panic attacks. And I always think it's really interesting applying games technology to something like that. And I think things like that often sort of like are the biggest example of like countering that thing, like that sort of stigma of video games, that's just, you know, you sort of drive around killing people and shoot up, you know, like people online and stuff. And it's like, well, no, like there is so much more to it. And that, like, I think when we can apply games technology to something very practical, like spotting early signs of dementia, it furthers, you know, like sort of gaming's credibility, but B, it just helps an awful lot of people.
I mean, nothing engages like video games, and it doesn't have to be used purely for, you know, passing the time. You can build up real-world skills. This is the whole point of what Jane McGonigal has been doing for years. How do we gather this collective willingness to participate and carry out virtual tasks and harness it for good? So it's an area I'm absolutely fascinated by. But so what were the kind of key takeaways for you guys? You know, coming at it maybe, you know, with not quite such a nerdy interest.
Something I appreciated from it was, again, a little like the last one, was just the sheer range of backgrounds and odd paths into the positions that they were in. So, for instance, we had Claire who came specifically from studying science and things before, and then transitioning into games. But I was really interested in Elena from Yaldi, her path, because she seemed to come at it from more of a kind of business side, right? That she was always interested in games when she was younger, but she didn't specifically go into that kind of development course in terms of study, and then got this kind of funding through the Creative Bridge, had kind of learned some of the game design tools herself, and then kind of has found her way into, I mean, you'll know more about this than me, Brian, but that sounded like the path to me, which is like such a, you know, you can kind of come at this your own way, essentially, and make something that the thing that she's making, this game that kind of combines her interests in foraging and crafting and these kind of like very analog creative things, is like such a unique and personal kind of thing to be doing. Like it's the kind of thing that if you were already in a game studio, probably you're not going to think about, I'm going to make a game about picking up mushrooms, but you're kind of coming out from the outside, you have your idea. It was fascinating to me. Yeah,
I agree. And I think the way she's approaching it has been very, very clever. You know, she had the concept, she had the idea, but she's building a business. You know, she's gone through Creative Bridge. Yeah. She won the Converge Challenge. You know, she's picked up a reasonable amount of money because she's pushing this forward as a business, as a paying proposition. You know, it's not just, I have an idea, I want to make something, I'm going to make it regardless. And then at the end of the creation process go, okay, now what? So, you know, I think that it's a very clever way of approaching things. And I think a large part of why she's doing that is because she's not coming from a technical background. You know, and you're right, you don't have to be a programmer, a developer, an artist to make a game now. You know, the tools are out there. They're freely available to anyone who wants to use them. We're not short of people with technical skills or indeed creative skills, but we are short of people who are good at business. And so I really, really want this game to succeed. I think it's got a fantastic chance. I know an awful lot more about what she's doing in the background. I've been kind of helping out a little bit with some advice and introductions. So yeah, fingers crossed. By this time next year, we're talking about the huge success that Wholesome Out and About has achieved in the global marketplace, and we'll all meet up outdoors and pick some mushrooms.
Speaking about different paths into games and like people approaching it from different ways, that seemed to be a major takeaway from yesterday's games research. I mean, I know I'm that good. Brian's giving me a wee okay sign, and yeah, what a transition. But yeah, like this sort of idea of being able to approach games research from any sort of angle as well is really cool. We had Gabe, who we've had on the channel and podcast, who came from a sort of literature standpoint. We had a couple of people who came from psychology, graphic communications, like programming. Like we had loads of different people from like a variety of different backgrounds, all doing very different things, but still being games researchers. Like it's such a broad term, and it's such a new and exciting topic that I think we've mentioned it on the podcast before that we're really needing to tap into and talk about more.
Absolutely, and it's a really brave move for a festival in its first year to have more or less an entire day. It was 11:30 to 4 o'clock of back to back researchers and looking at such a broad range of areas. Again, to just repeat what you just said, Ryan, it's fascinating. There's so many different approaches. There are so many different takes on this, and so many areas which are directly relevant to us as gamers, to us as developers, to us as the media. I thought drilled down into an area that is far too often overlooked when it comes to video games events.
Do you know, I think we'll just end up sort of speaking about various people that spoke throughout the day, but I think I want to start with William Kavanagh, because we had him on the website. Brilliant article written by, I believe it was our very own Andrew Gordon.
This just in, I think it was.
And since I wasn't in the call when you guys interviewed him, it was really interesting to actually hear him talking about what he's doing. And it was really interesting that you added this bit from someone asked a question, and he added in that games balancing isn't just like a uniform blanket thing. You don't just balance for let's say you're making the next Mortal Kombat. You don't just balance so the top level players can pick up any character and just play. You've got to balance it in such a way that there are characters that are, as he put it, just good at punching. You don't need to be good at combos or whatever. You could just pick up one character and be like, oh, I get what I'm doing here. But then that character can be countered with something from a different skill level where someone is using combos or whatever. And trying to adjust so almost anyone can pick up and play. It almost reminds me in a really weird way. My dad's a golfer, and it reminds me of the handicap system, if you get what I mean. Sure. The idea that anyone can play against anyone else, and because of that, because of the handicap system, you're on a level playing field. And the idea of what he's doing is almost adding that to video games, and it's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, again, like so many of the other areas of the game studies, that was discussed yesterday, it's taking something that was a bit of a black art, or a bit of a something that was based on gut instinct and playtesting, and really producing a different way of providing quantifiable balancing and doing something, introducing scientific rigor to an area that was more or less made up. And it's one of these areas, games is still the youngest sort of media type out there. It's only really been an industry for the last 30 odd years. And so much of it has changed in the last 5, 6, 10 years because of the constant evolution of technology. The introduction of mobile, it's the opening of the app store, the evolution of the app markets have completely changed people's approach to games, the audience for games, and has forced new business models, new revenue streams, new ways of working, and new ways of interacting with each other. So again, I think all of the speakers that we had yesterday are doing incredibly valuable work, and it's helping the industry evolve. You know, it's racing ahead in commercial terms and sometimes in, you know, creative terms, but you know, we're playing catch up on the scientific rigor side of things. So I found it really, really gratifying that there are so many people out there, and you know, Glasgow's not the only university doing this. You know, we'd love to hear from the people at Abertay, at Napier, UWS, GCU, whoever's out there studying games or in the field of game studies. Come and talk to us, because we want to find out more about what you're up to.
We started off with the PhD students, I believe they were, and we had Francis Butterworth Parr, who was speaking about metaphors in games, and what they can provide. Does anyone want to cover that?
It was tricky, but the thing that I found most fascinating about it was that we've had this conversation about, you know, the link between the right wing and kind of what we saw before in Gamergate and this kind of thing. And obviously nobody thinks that Gamergate is the start of Trumpism or something. It's like part of the same continuum, but it's not like, you know, like it's not like Gamergate caused Trumpism. But the thing that he was talking about was that the way that the right wing is and that kind of part of, you know, that kind of community communicates is in games language. Like, these are people who play games, who that's part of the way that they communicate online, you know, like on 4chan or something like that. And his kind of thought on that is that we need to look at games and discover kind of if there's something about the kind of communities that they build that is something that comes from there and is something we can do something about, or what is good behavior that's encouraged and what is bad behavior encouraged and stuff like that. And you know, there's all sorts of opinions you can have about this. You can say, you know, it's nothing to do with that, it's about the people who come to it, etc., etc. But either way, it's certainly worth studying, I would say. That was my big takeaway from his stuff.
Yeah, very much so. You know, there's an elephant in the room when it comes to gaming, and it's the fact that there is an overwhelming sense of privilege in some parts of the gaming community. There's toxicity that kind of came to a head with Gamergate, and it needs to be addressed. You know, we can't just say, oh well, it kind of died down and it's all gone away. We know that it hasn't. You know, there are still people out there who are harassing and bullying and doxing and swatting and doing really, really awful things to other people simply because of who they are, where they come from, their gender, their sexuality, ethnic background, whatever it happens to be, right? Gaming should be an inclusive, welcoming place. You know, the Scottish Games Network is a signatory of the Raise the Game pledge, which is we will do our best to reflect more accurately the society that we live in, not only in the makeup of our teams, but in the games that we produce. And I firmly believe that it's an issue that has to be addressed. So having a researcher out there who's looking at this and looking at the ways in which this is reflected within the games and you know, the communities themselves, I think it is incredibly valuable.
So we had a handful of other students that spoke. Kirsty Dunlop spoke about merging hybrid creative thinking and new media, and spoke about like what hybrid form was, and essentially the idea of like a piece of media that presents itself as one thing but is actually multiple. So the idea of like a book that is also an essay, or a video game that is potentially more of a sort of poem, you know, and it's sort of telling a poetic story. Like, it's quite an interesting field in itself. What did you guys think about that?
Well, I would say that the thing that she said, she had a quote, and I don't remember the quote verbatim, unfortunately, but the gist of it was that the idea is that these hybrid forms allow you to say something that you wouldn't be able to say otherwise. You know, it's very much like the medium is the message thing. It's by exploring this kind of new form, you can say something new that hasn't been said before. And I think that's like a huge part of the way that people talk about video games as well, right? That it's because it's this kind of emerging form that we're still working out and we're still shaping. It gives you all these opportunities to kind of portray experiences and ideas that you couldn't otherwise. So I think it's very linked in there, this looking at stuff that's been done, as you said, like in weird essay forms and experimental literature and stuff like that is totally applicable to the stuff in games as well.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it kind of reflects back on what we were saying about the Games for Health and Wellbeing panel that I chaired. Games can be so much more than just entertainment. And even the games which are designed for entertainment can do far more than just fill in some time. You know, you can tell stories, you can convey meaning, you can do a huge amount. It's just that, as you said earlier, Ryan, we kind of have this perception in the UK that games equal digital toys, therefore kids, therefore they cannot have mature content, they cannot have any additional meaning beyond the headshots. And there are a lot of games that are big dumb fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. But again, it's just so fascinating to hear people who are exploring these different areas and the different ways in which games can impact us as the audience, but also as the developers, the creators, the practitioners who want to do something beyond the conventional.
Yeah, going back to what you're saying about like big dumb fun being okay, I don't think people can judge video games and be like, oh, they are just that, when film, The Expendables and Citizen Kane are the same medium. But they set out to do totally different things, and that's okay. Yes, The Expendables is a popcorn flick, and you sit and you enjoy like all the big explosions and people shooting guns and like the one-liners and the quips, and that's fun. It's enjoyable. You can sit and watch it on like a Sunday afternoon, have a good laugh. But then at the same time, you have movies like Citizen Kane that ask questions about morality and, shine a light on the negative sides of the human condition. And both are totally fine and totally, valid in their own way. But we can't, you can't say that we can only have one or the other. The idea of limiting a medium to just one thing is ridiculous,
Well, in that case, it's not a medium.
Yeah.
It's you were talking about comic books earlier. When Watchmen first came out, people were amazed that it could tell such a story focusing on the human condition in a world of superheroes without the capes and the hammers and the metal armor. And you're right, pretty much every medium out there can aspire to the condition of art. Literature, music, film, television, performing arts, visual arts, fine art. Everything. Video games exists within this continuum, in this whole wide range of media that we as a society can enjoy. So I'm all for the fact that we have big dumb video games and we have exquisite heart-breaking games like That Dragon Cancer and new forms of narrative like Dear Esther. More of that kind of thing, please. Including the big dumb fun. Again, Rage 2, I'm just really enjoying zooming around the desert and splatting things. There's nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't mean that there's no space for the more thoughtful, thought-provoking pieces, and indeed, puzzles featuring tapeworms.
Exactly that. Yeah, like I was wanting to say, like, To Kill a Mockingbird's a book, but do you know what else is a book? The Mr. Men series. There's room to move, within a medium. And
important lessons to be learned from the Mr. Men.
I mean, you can learn an awful lot. Like, we can shape ourselves. We should all aspire to be Mr. Tickle, and it's that simple. Actually, no, we shouldn't. No, please, no.
Okay, possibly the worst example you could have chosen, Ryan.
Yeah, don't molest people. Right, anyway. Anyway, swiftly
the
on.
Scottish Games Network disclaimer. It's like, don't listen to Ryan.
Yeah, don't listen to Ryan when he's freeballing and trying to name a Mr. Men, and all of them go.
We're loving the chat, but no, Mr. Tickle is not necessarily the example that you want to choose.
The only one I could think of at the time was Mr. Tickle. Brian, you've got a kid.
I've got the entire collection. Yeah.
Please name a more like aspirational Mr. Men.
Mr. Bounce.
Mr. Bounce, there we go.
For the plain and simple reason that back when video games gave you 8 characters for your username, I chose Mr. Bounce. So I was Mr. Bounce for the first 10 years of this century when playing video games. So there you go. That's why you should be Mr. Bounce. But not in video games, because that's me.
we're growing nicknames this episode apparently. So next week we'll have, this is the Scottish Games Network podcast brought to you by Tintin, Mr. Bounce, and now we should need one for Andrew.
By the end of this episode, we'll have one.
Oh, 100%. The next talk was by Monica, and it was about sort of VR, and I think it was called The Never-Ending Immersion, and I really enjoyed this. Essentially, she was speaking about your VR self and what you sort of what you're going to portray, or what you portray in like a virtual reality space. It's just as much of you as like yourself in the real world. And she spoke about like what is immersion, and she broke it down into the virtual gaze, virtual space, and virtual self. Just for brevity, I'm pretty sure that Playaway are going to be uploading these talks at some point. They recorded all of them, so I reckon we'll leave the people that spoke about these things to discuss it, because they'll definitely cover it better than we will, especially considering I scribbled down notes. Yeah, I think we'll cover that a wee bit more in the future, but the idea of who you choose to portray yourself as is just as much yourself as what we are, behind closed doors, is quite an interesting idea. And it's a philosophy that dates back. I remember hearing something about we have three masks, the idea, the one that we show the world, the one we show our close friends and family, and then the one we show ourselves. And I feel like this is an the idea of VR and who we are in the virtual space is almost an expansion of that.
The whole question of digital identity and who you play in games has been around since the very, very beginning. Famously in arcades, when they had a high score, it's they only chose 3 letters because it stopped you leaving your identity as a 4-letter word. And people would just do swears. As soon as you could start picking a character, as soon as you could start customizing a character, you've been able to portray yourself in different ways. So gaming in a lot of ways pioneered the issue that we're finding in social media, which is on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. So we are still dealing with this, and it's an issue that's going to come into sharp focus later this year, because we now have the Information Commissioner's Office have produced their age-appropriate design guidelines. This is now a law, so you're going to have to look after your players, you're going to have to look after your community, you're going to have to make some tough decisions about the features that you introduce into your gaming if you have any kind of online component. And the onus is now on developers and publishers and creators to think about how people are going to portray themselves within games, how they're going to be able to interact, and what their level of moderation and curation and, protecting their players from harm, creating a stable and safe environment. And so I think this is, again, massively encouraging that we've got people out there looking at these issues in different ways, because it's something that the sector is going to have to proactively address unless it's going to have legislation imposed upon it. And, we as an industry are not famous for taking a proactive and adult approach to the issues that are being uncovered by the evolution of games. So, yeah, I find the whole thing, again, fascinating and a great exploration of a different take on this issue.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway from this podcast is when all the Playaway talks go live and you can watch them back, definitely do so if you didn't catch them the first time round. They're well worth a watch. Now, we only have one more talk from the PhD student, and that was Preserving Games by Lauren Watson. Now, we were speaking about this a wee bit before the show, so do you guys want to kick off and we'll just jump in from there?
I mean, It sounded like you were the most interested in it, so by all means, please.
Yeah, no, of course, no problem. So I found it fascinating because I'd never really thought about it. We've all played an emulator or played a port or whatever of a game, but the idea of preserving video games in the same way that we preserve film and books and all that, it's like in music, it's quite interesting because Lauren proposed the idea that if video games are a bit more complex than just preserving the celluloid of, we mentioned Citizen Kane earlier, that it's a bit more difficult than that, because do we preserve the initial experience or do we preserve the code that was released to start with? And they showed Metal Gear Solid to start with, and in PlayStation 1, you only had a limited amount of colours to use. So developers would kind of blend colours to create like gradients and to create different colours that weren't available. And on CRT monitors, that looked relatively smooth. Whereas if you look at it on a HD TV, it doesn't. It looks blocky. And so people have sort of came up with ways of smoothing out those textures and making them look the way they did on CRT monitors. But then there's an argument that we shouldn't preserve that because that isn't the original code. And it's almost like a remix of what the original was. However, others would argue that what you're wanting to do instead is preserve that remix, if you will, because it presents what the game looked like initially and what it felt like initially. So it's a really interesting idea that I'd never thought about at all. I'd never even considered, like, how do we preserve games?
It's a very, very interesting area, and it's one that is becoming more and more relevant as time goes on, because so many of the devices that you needed to play early video games, are no longer commercially available. And there's a whole other side to this, the notion of abandonware and greyware. So if I bought a copy of the original Lemmings, but the disc's degraded or my Amiga broke, I still have, I have the discs, let's say. I should still be able to play it. So am I allowed to play it on an emulator? And there's a really big gap in the video game sector. We don't have a long tail like you do in music or you do in cinema, you do in film. You can go and buy the movies created by the Lumiere brothers, Méliès, and watch them on 4K on your flat screen TV. You can listen to albums from the birth of music, with Delta blues and everything going way back to the beginning of the 20th century. But in games, we don't have that kind of that legacy. Games fall out of existence. And so the publishers still own the intellectual property. Presumably, they've still got the source code somewhere, but it's just sitting there in limbo and nothing happens with it. So do the players have the right to emulate it? Does the industry have a responsibility, to keep it safe? And there are a few archive and preservation projects going on around the world, including the UK National Video Game Museum. But it's something that I've been looking at. If you go to the Scottish Games Network website and you have a look at the company directory, scroll all the way down to the bottom, you've got the sort of the sadly missed and dearly departed list of all the companies who are no longer active. And just going through them, you can see so many studios who produced, by my own count, in some cases dozens, in some cases hundreds of video games that you can no longer play. Our friends at Denki pioneered the online interactive TV games for Sky when you pressed the red button, and they did over 100. If you have a look at their Wikipedia page, you'll see a big list. Who should preserve them? Because they did them for Sky. Are Sky preserving them? Possibly not. How do we do this? How do we build something that's a legacy outside pirated MAME games, and arcade ROMs that you can download from dodgy sites? There has to be a better way to do this. But as an industry, we're incredibly poor at asking these questions. So again, I find the whole topic itself deeply fascinating, and I find the approach to it really, really interesting. So I would love to find out more about where we can take this.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what Lauren's end result is, and I'd love to read through that if it's made available, which would be really cool. So the next couple of things that came up was Ruth Booth and William Kavanagh both chaired panels. Now, do you guys want to talk a wee bit about those two? Because like we said, this was meant to be a shorter episode, but it's making its way into a regular size. So we'll sort of try and merge these two panels together and just discuss kind of overview what both of them said, and then point you in the direction of the Playaway Festival so you can watch them yourself. So to start with, it was Ruth Booth's panel. That was with, I'm trying to read my own handwriting here, Charlie Harbord, Gabe Elvery, and Arthur...
I think it's Ellinger.
That's exactly it, yes. All had some really interesting stuff to say. Do you guys want to sort of cover some of that?
Yeah. Well, speaking of Toy Story, Charlie had a Toy Story background going on, there behind them and their thing. Your thing reminded me of that. But so they're at the University of Abertay doing research, and they had like a background in languages. They studied Mandarin and had been using RPGs to kind of teach Mandarin and teach English as a second language. And their thing was saying that they had gotten so much from living abroad and learning about other cultures that they felt that they had a kind of obligation to, promote Scottish culture and Celtic culture and the Gaelic language. So they started this initiative called the Kilted Otter, which is all about using kind of games to preserve Celtic heritage and to kind of help promote Gaelic, essentially. So it's we didn't get too, I think the Kilted Otter is kind of in the early stages of its initiative, but it's definitely something that I think we're probably going to be very interested in.
Yeah, I've got a note at the bottom of my bit about this panel that just says, talk to Charlie about Kilted Otter and her sort of RPG she's making, because that was really interesting, and I might be mistaken here, but what I took away from it was the RPG she's making is working in both Mandarin and English. However, they're developing it so you can drop in other languages in other. Is that right?
So it could be potentially modular, yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is like it could expand and sort of be playable to everyone, which is really cool. And I want to speak to her about that and see what comes of that.
Again, so much great work going on out there. And what Charlie's doing, she's looking at a series of game jams aimed at Indigenous cultures, including Gaelic. And again, it's not an area that really gets looked at. So she's already talking to MJ Alba and Born the Gaelic and a lot of the organisations keeping the Gaelic culture, the Gaelic language alive across Scotland. But she's also looking globally out into other Indigenous cultures around the world with a specific view of getting creativity through a short, game jam type experience and bringing those cultures into the world of gaming. I mean, hats off. It's an amazing initiative. And again, if we can help to support it, we absolutely will.
Yeah. And Arthur had a really interesting point of view as well to do with like live streaming music and sort of what that means for changing the medium of listening to live music. And, obviously with the pandemic happening, it's really helped his research, coincidentally, the way that now everyone's sort of doing live stream music. But he proposed the idea that the chances are we'll get to a point where gigs are not only like a venue full of people, but also people watching from their home via live stream, which was really cool. And I never thought about that, when I've been listening to music. Speaking of which, big shout out to the Playaway guys, or the Tinderbox guys even, for entertaining us in between the panels and talks. That was really cool, and some really good music came from that.
So just for anyone who's not been to Playaway yet, it's worth saying that Tinderbox Collective are primarily focused on music, or they have done until the Playaway Festival. And so at the start of every session, and to close out every session, we've had some of the incredibly talented artists and performers who are part of the collective giving us a wee song, which is a completely charming way to start and end what would otherwise be yet one more Zoom call in your calendar. And it really does help to break the ice. It helps bring people together. And I've found not only their organisation, the fact that there are so many facilitators and people from the collective there for every session, but it's just adding to the whole charm of the thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the idea of a video game and music festival. Sort of merging those two is really cool. And the idea that, a panel starts and finishes, and instead of everyone if this was in person, instead of being told, okay, now you need to naff off out of this room so we can set up for the next one, a musician comes on and plays for a wee while. And they spoke about that yesterday in between the panels. about how hopefully next year we can have a proper in-person Playaway Festival, and it'd be really interesting to see how that happens, and that'd be really cool, and potentially another SGN outing, which would be good fun. We seem to have a long list of these.
A long and growing list.
I think that... Apologies. Yeah, I'm still not used to the Zoom. I keep talking over everybody. I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it.
I think that relationship that you're talking about, the kind of cross-pollination between the music and the game specifically, like Arthur's research is a perfect example of that, because he was saying that, I mean, the reason that he's on this game studies panel is that there's so much writing already about live streaming and games, because it's such a huge important thing with Twitch, and games is pioneering with that. But obviously that's also relevant to concerts and things like that. And people over there haven't really been studying it so much because it hasn't been a problem until now. So now the musician academia side is going to games because they've already created this huge wealth of research. So, I mean, that's like a perfect example of like why it's so important to have this kind of discussion between the different sectors, because we've got so much knowledge to share with each other, like learning from each other and stuff.
Yeah,
and why it's good to have a festival that's both music and games.
Yeah, I mean, the perfect space. Now we just need a video games and film festival, and video games and book festival, and we're all good.
Well, believe it or not, just before we came on the call, I published a story on the Scottish Games Network about Vision Scotland, which is the country's first screen sector expo, which has been rescheduled back to September this year. But they're focusing on screen in its broadest possible sense. So film, television, animation, advertising, visual effects, and video games. So we will be there front and centre and making sure that we can do everything we can to help people understand more about this mysterious, insular and isolated, $175 billion industry that they've never heard of before. Entire amount of money that Scotland's screen industry has made ever, is probably eclipsed by one decent weekend for GTA Online. So, but no, we're delighted to support it. We're delighted to celebrate it, and yeah, there's far more that we could do. And again, watch the Scottish Games Network website. We've got a few ideas for you guys. And
the next panel, I feel like we're just gonna kind of gloss over this one a wee bit, and apologies to David, Ramona, and Robin because and William for hosting it, because I feel like it's best if we should leave you to speak to listen to them about it, because they were speaking about games research and getting into games research and what the importance of it, and we can sit here and speak about it, but we've said before that we didn't even really understand the whole how big games research was until a few weeks ago, and these guys have been working in it for years. So us trying to summarise what they're saying, we're just not going to do it justice. I feel like just pointing you in the direction of them is the best thing to do.
Well, it was all kind of meta, it was games researchers talking about games research. So I would agree. Go and listen. All of the talks have been recorded. They're all going to be appearing on the Tinderbox Collective website, and we would absolutely recommend that you do. Once the festival is over, we'll be doing a summary and we'll post it on the Scottish Games Network. So we'll signpost it, we'll link to it, we'll do everything. So, keep your eyes open, and as soon as we start seeing things appearing, we'll bring them straight to you.
And so we finished yesterday, which kind of takes us right up to date until, this goes live, and then it's immediately out of date because there's another talk already started. Gabe, a friend of the show and just all-round amazing person, spoke about Parasocial.
Hang on, Ryan. Hang on. Yes, she did. But so we also had the incredible Colin McDonald, who ran one of his Games Job live events towards the end of the afternoon from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and he pulled in some of the UK's heavy hitters, the biggest studios out there: Sumo, Team 17, Splash Damage, Mediatonic, Creative Assembly, and they were looking at Ubisoft. And Ubisoft, thank you very much indeed, Studio Gobo. There was a whole bunch, but they were looking at internships, graduate schemes, traineeships, how to prepare and what to expect, and essentially a beginner's guide to getting into the game sector. Hugely popular. When I checked in on YouTube, there were several hundred people watching the stream. So it's a fantastic new initiative from Colin. He's run a whole bunch of them very successfully, not just in the UK, but out across the world, and doing an awful lot to help people realise that you can have an incredibly rewarding career in the games industry. So fair play to him, and he did that fantastically well. And then we also had the Creative Informatics Lab number 15, which was looking at performing arts and digital technology, and so pulled together an awful lot of the people across Scotland who are either venues like the Traverse Theatre, who were doing a lot with ticketing, a lot with online performance. So again, an incredibly rich and diverse range of people who are working in this kind of related area, and it comes back and ties in so neatly to the whole approach of the Playway Festival. But I did that one, guys. And some really fascinating stuff coming out from the Traverse in terms of, it's all about new writers, it's all about new talent, but when you can't get people into the venue, how do you actually interact and relate with them online? So I'm hoping that we'll get a chance to talk to those guys at some point in the near future as well, because what they're doing is just wonderful.
And now on to friend of the show and just all-round amazing person, Gabe Elvery. They appeared on the YouTube channel last week, and they were speaking about their talk on parasocial relationships within video games. And for people that don't they might not know what that is, or you haven't checked out the video yet, or you weren't at the event. Essentially, a parasocial relationship is when you start, where a piece of fiction sort of affects you in such a way that you start treating characters as if they're real people, and you start to form a relationship with them where, and I think it can be both positive and negative from what I understand. So you've got, Game of Thrones was an example. You might have loved Jon Snow and thought Jon Snow was amazing and looked forward to seeing him every week, but then you might have hated Ramsay Bolton, and every time you saw him your blood boiled. That sort of depth was really interesting, brilliant to hear her speak about. And then they spoke about parasocial breakup and the idea that not only do we form parasocial relationships with fictional characters, but also with real people. I guess the most recent example would have been J.K. Rowling. And the idea that a lot of people, built up this idea of who they thought J.K. Rowling was and almost started to form a relationship in their head with her. And then recently, with the things that she's been saying, it's been quite polarizing, and there's some people who are almost going through a grieving process in the same way that they would with a friendship ending or a breakup, where you go through sort of some emotional torment. And that's quite interesting to think about in and of itself. And Gabe's sort of covering all of that within video games, which is just fascinating. And I can guarantee that almost everyone that's listening to this has played a video game and got emotionally attached to a character. And so it's an incredibly relatable topic and just something I'd never thought about. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, it's one of these areas where all too often we don't pay any attention to why we love some games, why we love some characters, why we relate to some particular hero or heroine or NPC. And it's because of this whole notion of parasocial attachment. And Gabe was incredibly interesting when it came to the ways in which we as the consumer, the audience, the player, can really form strong bonds. And again, it's one of these things that, starting as a writer, as I did, it's not something that I had consciously been aware of, but it's certainly something that I think many more people within the games industry are going to have to pay closer attention to, because it as you're building more and more lifelike characters, as you have relationships with characters in games that can encompass hundreds of hours, you're going to have to be a little bit careful. It really opens your eyes to the power that you have to create the attachments, or to potentially foster the breakup. So again, just the whole session was a joy, and from the actual presentation through to then going speed dating with actual ghosts. It was a delight.
Yeah. I think that there's two parts as well that were interesting to me, which was one, so Gabe spoke about how, obviously games with characters that you are very invested in are more, they're more likely to be successful and enjoyed by more people. I think that's definitely the case, and it linked back to something that Dan Pinchbeck was saying in his discussion, which was that he thinks that this kind of building of this connection and stories becoming more important in games and things like that are a huge part of what's making them more accessible in a mainstream sense. Like the fact that The Last of Us can be a thing that has a sort of emotional depth that people can recognize from film and television and from other things is part of why we can begin to bring more people in. So I thought that part was interesting, but also back on this kind of like parasocial breakup and these kind of difficult relationships, I think the thing that's so fascinating about researching that within games is that it's a safe space to try out this stuff, right? With the J.K. Rowling thing, you have people, that feel like it's difficult to deal with that situation because they've become so attached to this person over time, and they end up defending someone even though maybe the things that they're saying are not particularly that defendable. If you can go through that relationship, if you can simulate that relationship in a game, and it can kind of give you the tools that you need to think through that process, like that's huge. If people can start to simulate that kind of difficult situation, like the potential is huge, I think.
Fantastic. So that kind of brings us to the end of week one of the Playway Festival. We have an entirely fresh week coming up, events taking place over the weekend. Rather than try and summarise it, because everything that we've seen so far has been incredible. But we've got workshops, we've got panels, we've got talks, presentations, we have live performances, a whole range of different things that are coming up over the next week. And if the last 5 days have been anything to go by, whatever you tune into and whatever you decide to sign up for is going to be absolutely worth your while. And obviously we'll link to the Playway Festival, the Tinderbox Collective registration page in the show notes.
Yeah, so I reckon that wraps us up, I suppose, for this short episode, air quotes, because I feel like it's just going to turn out to be a regular episode. But oh well. So it leads us.
Good stuff to talk about.
That's it. There was so much good stuff that just doing a summary seemed to be, an injustice.
Yeah, it's a testament to how good the show is.
Yeah, I think one thing we should maybe call out is the closing performance. They started off with an absolute blinder with Jane McGonigal's keynote, but they're closing with something completely different. So, Ryan, would you do the honours?
Oh, of course. So this week's spotlight is Chipsel, or Niamh Houston. She's a Northern Irish musician who has composed games such as Super Hexagon and Dicey Dungeons. She also produces her own music, but most bizarrely and amazingly, she does it with a Game Boy.
She does it with several Game Boys.
Well, several but it blows my mind. And I was listening to her on Spotify this morning. Again, link in the show notes for everything we speak about. Go listen to her. It's so difficult. I always find it difficult to promote musicians or artists, when I'm writing the Freelance Friday, without just going, here's their stuff, because I can tell you how great and amazing their work is, but if you're not experiencing it yourself, you're just not getting it. And I feel like that's 100% it with Chipsel. So definitely check out Niamh on Spotify or any other platform that she's available on. So yeah, that's our spotlight of the week. Just there's your homework. In between the Playaway sessions, just have whatever your music playing platform of choice is on in the background, and just hit play on some Chipsel tunes.
Yeah, and if you don't believe that somebody playing several Game Boys can absolutely kick butt and rock out with some, really seriously old school chiptune, you are about to have your eyes opened and your mind blown. Yeah, she's phenomenal, and I'm really, really looking forward to that. I'm going to be getting the big speakers out for that one.
100%. Not only that, it's a gig. You know, when was the last time you went to a gig?
I know, holy crap.
Yeah.
December 2019.
Mine's...
That's too long, man.
Oh, what was it?
Murder Capital. It was Murder Capital at the Vaults in Edinburgh. It was okay.
Mine's was... We thought about it the other day, because you know how Facebook has the memories thing. It was last Valentine's Day. A local music venue for us, Krakatoa, was doing a battle of the final of their battle of the bands. A group of us all went down and watched that, and local band Bliss won it. Big shout out to Bliss, they're great. Check them out.
Check them out, but buy the Mogwai album.
Yes, so we've given
Buy them
you
both.
a nice sort of backlog of music to listen to this week. You've got Chipsel up top, and then Mogwai, Bliss. Check them all out, definitely.
And if you're at all interested, game studies. Seriously, this is it's the future.
Yeah, 100%. It is sheer insanity just how much is being covered in that field. And yeah, just go check out all the speakers from the Playway Festival, because they all have very worthwhile things to say. That wraps up this week of the Scottish Games Network podcast. As always, we've been your hosts. I've been Ryan.
I've been Mr. Bounce.
And I've been Andrew.
Thank you ever so much for watching, and we shall see you next week.